Welcome back to You Must Be Woken and to our mini-series In the Spotlight. We're continuing our ethos of having honest and sometimes difficult conversations around diversity and inclusion by shining a spotlight on guests who can bring to life the topics and issues that have a real impact on today's workplaces. Today, we're discussing how traditional ideas of masculinity influence men's mental health in the workplace. How do workplace cultures unconsciously reward emotional suppression, and what happens when leaders genuinely model vulnerability?
And Craig and I are absolutely thrilled to welcome somebody who's at the forefront of this whole topic. So Tim Barber. Tim, who's the host of the podcast Feel Good for Men Who Want Change, and also started the Feel Good Folk, which offers content, coaching, and a community around healthy masculinity and men's well-being. So huge welcome, Tim.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, really good to have you in the studio. Are you well?
Yeah, really good. Yeah, thanks. It's been, a sort of transition into autumn. I think we're all feeling that a little bit. I know you've just got a book out. I've just come back from a book writing retreat of my own in sunny Portugal, where it was 22 degrees and stepped off the plane back here. It's like, quite sure I was ready for that. But yeah, other than that, all good.
Amazing. Yeah, it's coming to the end of the summer. Dawn's just come back from a nice retreat as well, haven't you?
I have, yeah. Completely detoxed and relaxed and didn't get off the plane till late last night. So wide awake today.
Yeah, we're getting the best of you. The best of you today.
I feel like I'm the only one that hasn't been on a retreat.
You need to go. I think we need more info on this book writing retreat. I like the idea of that.
Let's not write another one too soon, right? Bit of a painful process. Okay, before we get into the detail of today's episode, shall we find out a little bit more about you, Tim? On your Feel Good Folk website, you talk a lot about yourself in that by your early 30s, you say you were overweight, unhappy and dissatisfied with work, a subpar husband and father, and wondering what the point of it all was. It's a bit defaming for yourself there. What's going on?
Yeah. I mean, look, it's one of those things where, you know, what's going on inside your head, you never let it all out. But that's genuinely how I felt at the time, right? I felt like I was living a script that I had been handed and was doing the things I was supposed to be doing, but wasn't really finding them fulfilling. And I suppose it's worth saying at this point, I sort of spend my time in two worlds, even right now. And the first is I work in the people advisory space, HR, and I work with mostly startups to help them with their people. So, you know, pertinent to this conversation and the work you do as well, but a lot of work on culture, leadership, coaching, that kind of thing. And parts of that I enjoyed, but what I was really slipping into was doing what I felt I should be doing as a man. And again, pertinent to this conversation, you know, at my career, at home, as a husband, as a father. And it was just leading to unhealthy habits to do with alcohol. So I've been sober for 4 years this coming February.
Hey.
And getting sober was the catalyst for addressing all of those things that you mentioned in the introduction there. And I lead with those because not all of them other people will be going through, but a slither of them, men in particular, find relatable or might find relatable. And what I tried to do with the Feel Good Folk and what I do with my men's work alongside the organizational work that I do is try to help other men, whether that's through the podcast, whether that's through writing, whether that's through coaching or community, to address some part of that they might be feeling for themselves. But the core of it for me was, nearly 4 years ago now, getting sober, and that led to me doing a load of self-work on what had got me to that point, and why was I making certain decisions in my career, why was I making certain decisions at home, why was I making certain decisions at the pub, and doing that self-work over the years led to me addressing my own version of masculinity, and then basically continued to pull at that thread, and that got me to trying to explore that even more deeply and help other men who might be doing the same.
And we should probably say we're recording this in November, so there's a big focus this month on men's mental health in particular, isn't there? So it's quite fascinating to have you in the studio. Talk us through what that's meant for you over the years and how you've gotten to where you are today, and interestingly, what other men saying to you, right?
Yeah.
And I think that that's the area that I'm really interested in exploring with you, to understand what it really means to feel good as a man today. What have you learned around what men actually expect of themselves, and how has that changed?
Yeah, I mean, I would always caveat it that, I have, I'm a straight white man, and so my experiences are going to be, my own viewed through that lens. With the work I've done with the podcast and the writing, I've then tried to broaden that perspective and learn from others who are also working in this space. And it's important to say that, some men don't experience these things, right? And some do, but for different reasons or to a greater or lesser extent. But generally speaking, what I've learned and what is at the core of what I'm trying to work through, with myself and with others, and I'm going to give a talk at school next week as part of a facilitation work that I do to help boys and young men who are going through this too, is basically understand and then challenge the script or set of cultural stereotypes that we either consciously receive or subconsciously receive through role models in our life or through cultural memes and icons around what it is to be a man. And there's a lot of research around this, and one of the models that's been named is the man box, and that basically refers to this set of rigid stereotypes that many men may feel compelled to live by, either knowingly or unknowingly. And what I have done, and what seems to have been something that has been valuable for others to do, is first of all to recognize that, because when you see it, then you can't unsee it. And then you start to see why you might have been acting a certain way or making certain decisions, because of this script that you've inherited, because of these set of rules. And then once you see it, you can start to challenge it and opt out of it where it serves you best to do so. And I think it's important to caveat here, and one of my guests on my podcast said it really well, is that this isn't about being less masculine. It's about being more fully human, which is to say,
Nice.
once you understand the man box and you see it for what it is, then you can start to say, okay, well, these parts serve me and they serve the people around me, and these parts don't. And so, what does it mean to be a good man? I think it's more about what does it mean for you to be a good man, rather than me prescribing that for you. And that really is about understanding and then choosing how you want to show up as a good man.
I love that. I think that the bit you talked about there in the schools bit is so important, right? Because we both got children, and Dawn's more grown up now, but mine's just hitting high school, and so for me, he's going through that period right now of understanding what it is to be a man, and he's learning so much from me as well. And I see it because people will say to me, "Oh, Jacob said this the other day; it was really funny." Because he's hearing me joke about things, and therefore he's repeating that. And I'm always very conscious, like, oh, I hope I'm not making the wrong types of jokes, right? That he's going to get himself into trouble and that kind of stuff. And it is a big thing, and it links back to we talked about this previous on another podcast, the Netflix show that Stephen Graham did, that Adolescence, and then he's now got another campaign out, hasn't he? Letters to My Boy and stuff, and it's all linked to that. What is masculinity in 2025? What is it for men to be men in 2025? And there's some narrative out there that says, "Is it under attack? Are you under attack for being a man in this day and age?" And I love this theory of actually it's about you. What is it? What does it mean to you, rather than what is the stereotype for everybody else? And I think if we can help young men, in particular, start to try and articulate that for themselves, that's huge, right?
Absolutely. And look, you title of your book in the background, "Woke is Broke." I really share that sentiment, because I think what we've seen with the progressive left is a lot of finger wagging, a lot of telling boys and men what not to do, and the reality is we're seeing young men move to the right politically, globally. And I think my sense is that is as a result of not being given an empowering and relatable message about what it is to be a man, rather being told, what not to do, that you can be a threat, that you're a threat, that you're a problem. And there are, of course, unhelpful and unhealthy traits that men display. that we need to address, absolutely. But I think the result of a lot of the sort of shaming and finger wagging, it's heard. And when boys and young men they go online and they search for advice, they get a reassuring message from the unhelpful online masculine stereotypes that we know and we see, and they're the ones telling them, no, you're cool, you're good as you are, men are strong, women are the enemy. And that is a reassuring message to a young man who's not necessarily hearing that from elsewhere.
Sure.
And I clearly I can't entirely relate to the male ethics, but what I can relate to is having been brought up with a very strong traditional father and being surrounded, even now, with friends I've known all my life who were brought up in a drinking culture, football culture, at very, very far right. And I guess my point is that some of that actually is hugely positive, because I remember my father using football as a stress reliever to go and scream and shout, not inappropriately necessarily, and then to go and have a beer or two and talk about the stuff that people don't talk about, I guess. So it's important we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, my sort of thesis is that that's what we're seeing a little bit is we have done that a bit too much. And then all that does is embolden the voices on, we could just say the right, but embolden those voices who will inhabit that space and just welcome more people to it, because they're the ones saying, no, that you're fine as you are. And I think we need to do that in a way, we need to challenge that in a way that recognizes the strength and the service that communities like sports teams, and drinking cultures, approached healthily can provide men and women, but do so in a way that recognizes where it also isn't serving men, right? Because I mean, one of the great campaigns over the last few years around men's mental health was the Norwich City Football Club, their advert,
Brilliant.
right? Which I know you've seen, and struck home with a lot of people, and there are too many men who will hide behind these things sometimes, right? Because they are coping mechanisms. Like for me, my coping mechanism is alcohol, and yet everything can seem fine on the outside, but it's really not. So it's about saying, yes, actually, too many men are lonely. Too many men don't have friends. Sports teams and third spaces are, integral to making sure that doesn't happen. And at the same time, they can be a crutch, and they can help to exacerbate the problem if they are just amplifying, negative thoughts or negative spaces.
Absolutely.
Yeah, love that. I want to move us just slightly into workplaces a little bit, because I think there's obviously a huge amount of campaigns out there now. So you mentioned the Norwich City Football Club one. I love that. I think it's brilliant. You've also seen some of the memes now on the internet with the pictures that says, Bob's depressed or whatever, but actually Bob's not this one at the front that looks quite miserable. It's the guy at the back laughing, right? And so we're trying to change the stigma around mental health in particular, and workplaces play a big role in that, right? And I pulled out some stats. We do like a bit of stats on this podcast. So this was from Aviva last year, and it said fewer than 1 in 10 men, so 6%, said they discuss mental health struggles with their employer. A third said they never discuss mental health at all in the workplace. And over half of men surveyed said they'd actually taken time off because of mental health. So they take the time off, but they don't discuss it and, would never disclose it at work. That's huge, right?
Yeah, it is. And at the same time, it plays into, wider data around men's mental health that we know, which is that, cultural stereotypes and cultural expectations are that men don't share this stuff, right? And that they certainly don't do it in the workplace. Their job is to turn up, earn money, provide for the family, do so stoically, and go home. And so in some respects, those things aren't surprising. And I think the skill here for organizations is to understand what is an organizational problem or challenge, and what is a challenge to do with your male workforce. Because what was interesting about those Aviva stats is that some of the stats were basically the same for women too, which suggests to me actually maybe there's something going on with that organization, not necessarily something going on with men. And so I think this is where the sort of micro meets the macro a little bit, which is like we know that the macro cultural trends are that men, less so than women, will talk about their mental health challenges and seek help for it. And we know that for men under the age of 50, I'm 38, the most likely thing to kill myself is me. So we know these are like macro trends. So for then it's like, where does that meet the micro trends of like what's going on in the workplace? And so those Aviva stats were quite interesting to me because, you know, and there's some different ones out there as well. But like, what is an organizational trend? You know, and something to do with like having a good workplace, and then what can organizations do to support men and women?
And I think it would be really interesting. I love stats, as you know, but to do some layering in terms of looking at traditional working class environments, you know, manual labour, for example, compared to professional labour. And I think that would be very interesting because I think although you have a much more bantering environment, I think there is much more openness from my experience in those sectors.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a guy doing some good work in this space called Steve Whittle. Pretty sure his name's Steve Whittle. And he's got a not-for-profit called Tough to Talk, and he does a lot of work in those industries. And in those industries, you know, it was simple things like, you know, they had suicide prevention posters up in the men's loos, but they used, I guess, classically feminine imagery, you know, and pink writing and that kind of thing. And it was like simple changes like that, you know, suddenly made these services more relatable and more used. So this is where, again, it's like, what are the micro things going on within your organization to say, okay, like, what is the demographic of our workforce? Therefore, what messages are most likely to resonate with that workforce? And therefore, how should we approach this challenge? Because the Aviva one was like 1,000 men, 1,000 women, nationally representative across the UK, like cool. But like most organizations aren't like that.
No. I guess the bit that I'm going to play devil's advocate slightly here, right? Because when you think about these statistics, and you could pull the Aviva ones one, but you could pull a million of them that say very similar things, right? Men don't talk about it. Women don't talk about it. Yet, as a society in our country, we've got the biggest welfare bill now that we've ever had for mental health conditions. So someone's talking to someone and someone's going somewhere. Why is that vastly different? We're happy to go and tell the doctor, get some benefits, but we're not happy to talk about it at work. We're not happy to declare it at work. You know, there's a big stark difference in that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we know, you know, the women access these sorts of therapies more than men do. I guess the question it raises for me is, if people aren't willing to raise it at work, they probably don't have the psychological safety to raise it at work, particularly men, because it requires them to practice a behavior that they haven't for most of their life, most likely, right? If they've inherited this man box. Like, it's just, often men don't have this language and don't have this tool to be able to, you know, identify what the problem is and then deal with it. So I think for me, that tells me two things. One is, if you won't talk about it at work, you probably don't have the psychological safety to do it, and therefore even going and addressing things outside of work, if you just come back to the same environment, it's just going to carry on. And then secondly, if you don't have the psychological safety to even raise it at work, work is probably going to be a contributing factor to what's going on and exacerbating things that are going on personally as well.
And I think, just to follow on from that, because I agree with you entirely, I think also, you know, the support services are signposting some really good stuff. You know, I've just had an experience where I've shared an environment with some men who are facing some very significant mental health challenges, and they haven't accessed it through talking to their direct line manager. They've accessed it either through men's clubs or employment assistance programs that have referred them on to some intense therapies. And that's a really key point.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where the environment, you know, has changed a lot over the years, where, you know, the availability of, you know, men's groups, men's circles outside of work is massively increased versus what it was, you know, 10, 15 years ago and when I started in the workplace. And so I think there is an opportunity for men to access this stuff outside of work, where they might ironically be more comfortable to sit in a room full of strangers at like an Andy's Man Club, for example, to talk about this stuff, rather than they are at work, even though in theory the company is, doing the right thing by providing these services. So there's definitely more out there. For me, it's then like what is going on within the workplace that makes people not willing to access it.
So is there an argument then that says employers shouldn't bother providing these services if they're more accessed in the community? Is there a better way to spend their money rather than on stuff that people aren't accessing or talking about at work?
I don't think so. I think it's more about understanding, why it's not happening in the workplace and addressing that point. Because I think, my sense is, and I see this, my experience is mostly with smaller businesses and startups, but most of this stuff comes back to leadership. And I was on a panel a while back talking about equal parenting, and Deloitte had just made this big announcement around, offering, I think it was equal pay or something close to equal pay for maternity and paternity leave. My point then was, and I don't know if they've released any data, but like that's great, but until more junior male employees of Deloitte see male leaders, male partners taking 6 months off, they're not going to do it, or very few of them will do it, because again, like there's a big gap between like policy and provision of services, and then a culture of rigid masculinity that prohibits people using those things, even though technically they're available.
Nice.
And so I think there's this big gap here between like what is there,
a bit of role modeling and stuff. Yeah.
Exactly. And so so my answer then is like, no, I don't think organizations shouldn't bother. I think they absolutely should. One, because it helps women too. It helps all of us.
Yeah.
But secondly, because if you're going to talk the talk, you need to walk the walk, and you need your male leaders, your male role models to be the beacons for this for their male colleagues.
But I think coming even to a step before that, I think so few people understand the very early signs of mental health. Not at crisis point, because that sadly is obvious. You've only got a few routes to take, if at all. But those symptomatic elements 12 or 18 months before, when they start to kick in, and I think if that became commonplace in the workplace, understanding, for me, it was hair loss, for example, and, what's going on, that's really weird. The symptoms that are in place 12 or 18 months before crisis point.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And at the same time, I'd say it is also about creating a culture where people can share if they need to, because I think it's one thing to say to an organization to recognize symptoms, but that's also quite a big burden, right? To ask an organization to do that. It's going to be easier to address it, I think, if you can rely on someone to actively share, rather than sort of being continuously observant for the symptoms, particularly, again, for men who we know, those who have inherited or are living by consciously or subconsciously these set of rules in the man box, one of which is, do not show emotion, do not ask for help.
Don't show weakness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like they could be and are masking and hiding that for a very long time.
Yeah.
And I think it's important we don't make the employers responsible, but we make the people responsible. Backs of toilet doors. Are you experiencing any of these things?
Yeah.
This could be this.
Yeah.
And again, you sit and read that and go, oh, actually, yeah, maybe I should investigate that a little bit further. It's simple intervention, isn't it?
Yeah, it's simple intervention, repeated over time. And depending on the organization, it's for me, it's also about recognizing that, particularly for large organizations, you're going to have a real spectrum of men. Some for whom they kind of know what's going on, they just need to access some help. Some for whom can't put a name to that niggle in the back of their head about why they feel crap every morning when they wake up.
Yeah.
And that comes full circle to your question, really, in terms of I think this is my opinion purely. There's got to be a deck of cards of options for people, because there isn't one size fits all.
We talk about it quite a lot, not just from a mental health perspective now, but any interventions in an organization that you are trying to put in place to achieve something,
Yes.
it's usually not one thing. It's
Yes.
usually multiple interventions, right, that get you to where you want to get to. And this sounds like what we're saying here is very similar, right? So you might have signposted EAP services available for people. That in itself is not going to solve any kind of issues. So you need to create a culture where people are open to talk about it and are safe enough to use those services. You've got some role modeling there. You need leaders to be educated on trying to see some of the signs and know how to have those conversations with people, all of which starts to build up this deck of cards or this layered intervention to get you to a place where you can move the dial a little bit. And it won't suddenly just go swing and there you go, aren't we great? It's probably incremental, and some of that role modeling you talked about will go some way to helping that dial move, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then I think, there is also for a space for the very visible tactics that we're used to for other groups, right? Like setting up men's ESG groups in the workplace. You can get men's circle facilitators who are specifically trained to, run small groups of sessions with men to help them talk about what's going on in the workplace. And that can directly signpost to things outside of that as well. Book clubs, exercise clubs, basically any kind of men's spaces. But for me, those are very much the sort of tactical things that are the tip of the spear that should play a part of all those other things that you just listed too.
Yeah.
And I think they're great in a professional environment, aren't they? We also need to make sure we're providing those to our manual workers and people out on sites and all of those good things that are relative to them.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I've always felt quite strongly about things like mental health first aid in the negative, sadly. And I think, a good, robust conversation out on site can often be much more impactful.
So there's a couple of things in that I want to unbox, but I also want to come back to talking about, some of your experiences with the people you've had conversations with over time as well, because I think there's quite a lot for us to pick out in that. But just a couple of things on the workplace bit there. So I'll come back to the mental health first aid in a second, because I know we both feel quite strongly about this. But just going back to your point about these men's circles and stuff, right? And again, I'm going to play devil's advocate here.
Sure.
I have heard this myself full time, women saying, oh, for goodness sake, just because we've now started having a race group or this group, men want a group, right? Like they haven't had enough over the years. There is that attitude out there that says, oh, woe is me, the men are kicking off again. Let's do something for the men. Like, we have to change that narrative, right? We've got to stop that. Two wrongs don't make a right.
Yeah, I think so. And look, I think the line would always be that, none of this should come at the expense of the work we still need to do on women and any other marginalized groups. Shouldn't be that this is instead of other things, right? It should be because, I think we can recognize that there is a male mental health crisis is a strong word, but whatever you want to label it, there is a men's mental health issue. I don't know what else would have to be true for people to feel like we needed to pay attention to it. And the other point is that, like, men's behavior in the workplace impacts everyone, not just men. So if we can have men showing up, more fulfilled, more positive in a way that, is going to be impacting their colleagues in a positive way too, then it isn't just for men at that stage, it's for everyone.
And I think, from a female perspective, I can concur with some of that view until we start to introduce mental health. And, certainly the men in my life, personally and professionally, the moment I thought we were into mental health territory, my whole attitude would change to that. And I think it's really important we define clearly what we mean by the ERGs or...
But it comes back to, and I think we've talked a little bit about this previously, Dawn, but it comes back to this point you make about men then going online and being drawn to this narrative of you're okay, ignore them, this is the place to be for you, and creating this group. So if you think about International Men's Day, the grief people had about creating an International Men's Day because there's an International Women's Day, and that kind of debate between two sides of that argument, it's just really toxic and unnecessary, because actually then you hear this story about, but actually suicide among men is higher, et cetera, et cetera. There is a reason for this. And there always seems to be, for me, this undercurrent of, if we push something up, something else has to drop down.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be that way, right?
No, it doesn't. And it seems to me, like, the first thing to say is, like, obviously we need to recognize why so much work has been done to support women and girls in the first place, right? And so none of this, certainly from my perspective, is to say that we shouldn't have done that or we should stop doing that. So I think if we approach it with that caveat, and for me, the second thing is recognizing that the patriarchy harms everyone. And most men don't feel like they're coming from a position of power, although they do have some inherent power that women don't have, and that's worth acknowledging too.
Sure.
So then for me, it's about saying, okay, and well, then so what, right? And so what do we do about that? And I think it is about being able to separate the fact that men are struggling and we need to support them, and that doesn't come at the expense of what still needs to be done for others.
Yeah, love that. And I think this is the bit for me that employers grapple a lot with, because they're kind of then caught between this rock and a hard place. Geez, what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to do this, we're supposed to that. We can end up having a day for everything, right? And everyone, and it's about getting that balance right. And I really like that the way you just described that there. We've got an issue, we should tackle it, but it doesn't mean we should drop everything else in order to tackle it. It means we tackle it, right? And we do something about it while we continue to do something about the other things. We have to understand that actually our strategies in these places are going to be multifaceted. They're going to be on lots of different fronts. That's just life.
Absolutely. And, I think this is where, the work that we do and the work that others do in this space needs to evolve too. Like, for example, I'd love to see, and it's something I'm working on, like leadership development workshops to start to step into, okay, what are some gendered leadership norms we're all bringing to the table, right?
Nice.
Because one of the complaints you often see is, okay, fine, you've got more balanced leadership teams in terms of you've got more women at the table, but they're the women who display classically masculine traits. So, and they pull the ladder up behind them because, they are now playing that role, right, of the dominant aggressive male. And so have we actually achieved the outcome we want, or have we just placed more women who, we use frank language here that isn't, but are we just placing more women who act like men at the top table to make us feel better and make the gender pay gap report?
I like this discussion.
But you're talking our language now, right? Because that comes down to measuring not just the input and the output. It's about measuring the impact as well, right? And understanding what are we then getting as a result? Did we achieve what we set out to achieve? Because you could easily go and fill a board 50-50 with men and women. Doesn't mean it's necessarily going to change anything in an organization, right? It might change nothing. We see it. There's evidence that shows even if you have women on recruitment panels, they tend to recruit more men, right? Yeah. So it's not a case of, more women will make the difference. That's not how it works. It's the systems and the structures and the things that you do beneath that makes the difference, actually.
Yeah, exactly. And so then when it comes back to why do we even need to do this? Because it's super complicated and it's super messy, and one size doesn't fit all. And so one of the things I'm working on, for example, is a male leadership course, and a part of that is to help men understand the position of power that they hold. Some of that which is obvious and conscious to them, and some of it which isn't. And I think once you can start to have more male leaders stepping into their role as leaders, recognizing, okay, am I taking up loads of space in this room and space away from women? Okay, maybe I am. I hadn't thought about that before. How can I display this trait of, masculinity that I do want to do, bravery, strength, courage, in a way that actually quietens down some of the louder voices in the room and brings in some of the quieter ones? That's when you start to get true balance of competencies in a leadership team, away from traditionally masculine traits that, are the patriarchy has, rolled around all of our leadership teams, into something that is more balanced and nuanced, and actually then true diversity, true gender balance around our leadership tables.
Nice, love that. I think that's quite powerful, isn't it? And I guess that we talk a lot about this. The role leaders play,
yes,
and how leaders are often the squeezed middle. And I say leaders, middle managers, really, right? Because senior leaders have their own kind of world up here, and then you have your frontline teams in the world, and it's usually the middle managers that are in that squeezed middle. They're damned if they do, damned if they don't, and they never get the education or the training or the support to help them be what everybody needs them and wants them to be, right? Or if they do, it's usually subpar. It's not where it needs to be. So I think there's something in that for me about that education piece. Huge.
I agree with you both. My fear is we over-engineer this.
Yeah.
I have to be frank, and that we lose sight of the fact that if we are simply compassionate humans, you talked about being humans, that, we don't need or shouldn't need teaching. I appreciate we do, but it just concerns me. I'm a simple soul who believes that.
But I come back to that point about layering, right? So there's probably not a one-size-fits-all model. Yeah. You've got to tackle it with the youth, and you've got to get in early with, helping young men to understand how they can articulate for themselves what being a good human is, whether it's a good male human or good female human, it doesn't really matter because, to that point, there are men that experience domestic violence, right? So they need to know what a good human is as well as male, female, whatever. So there's a bit of intervention needed there. There's probably interventions needed in workplaces where there's generational differences here. Correct, because, I'm sure you've probably experienced this, Tim, with your conversations. They're bound to be generational differences between men and how they feel and what they then put out into the world.
Yeah, there's generational differences, there's industry differences, contextual differences. Like what your clients need will be very different to what my mostly London-centered startup-y clients need, who's mostly middle-class, white, people are going to have a very different set of requirements than your clients. So I think we need nuance for it. And so, one of the examples in the conversation I had was I worked with a chap called Alex, who actually now also works in the leadership space. And he was in the army and he was trying to drive culture change in the army. And they were running this session with a group of 300 infantry soldiers and, all quite hardened. And there was a sort of question put out to the room, which was like, when was the last time you cried? And they were sort of sniggering and crossed arms and that kind of thing. And then the most senior person in the room, the most senior soldier, not one of the leaders, stood up and said, all right, screw it. I cry every year on this date because that's the day I lost my daughter. And there was just this, expulsion of air in the room. And, suddenly it was okay for someone to share a piece of information like that. And that for me is just an example of how we can over-intellectualize some of this stuff, right?
Absolutely.
With these small sort of cultural moments, with these role models in an environment like that who make something okay. And that won't be it, right? That is a moment in time, but that might impact 10% of the people in that room, and they'll go away thinking something different. And then if you keep having things like that, keep pulling from that deck of cards that we've been talking about at different points, that's how culture changes over time, slowly and messily, I think.
Nice. And you make a good point. And I think we can get very hung up on generational, and it is, an incredibly important intersection, of course. But so is class, and so is financial, and so is background. And I think if we make sure that we're building every program to consider those intersections, we stand a chance of really getting to grassroots, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. And ethnicity plays a big part in it too. The cultural stereotypes and expectations of black men are very different to those of white men. So, this is for me, the great tension between, big gnarly challenges like this of we can over intellectualize it and make these too academic because it is so complicated and there are people really working down in the weeds. And so I think it is important to understand those things, but then we need to sort of zoom back out and be like, okay, so, in this environment for this company, what do we need to do?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly that. 65 quid for a therapy session online, that takes out a big proportion of the population.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a reason why something like an Andy's Man Club is so popular. And there's, to the point about generational things too. There's another one, I can't remember the name of it. I'm going to do them an injustice, but it's effectively a network of sheds where older guys can rock up with something they need to fix.
Yeah.
And so they do it in an environment with an activity they feel more comfortable with, tinkering in a shed. but they start to make friends and they can share things, and they do it slowly
Nice.
over time, right?
I love that. And I think that's the point, isn't it? There's so many of these little pockets of things that are popping up to try and solve these kind of needs. Then when you think about it from a workplace perspective, it becomes a massive challenge, isn't it? Because you think, oh gosh, we could do something here, we could do something there. And before you know it, you've got this big map. And what often happens then is employers go, it's too hard. We'll just outsource it to the EAP service and that'll do. Or, dare I say it, we create some mental health first aiders because they'll solve everything for us, right?
Yeah.
And we're all suddenly
I'm
shudder a
sensing
little
your
bit,
position on mental health first aiders.
I've just seen it go so badly wrong.
Well, I think it's, partly woke is broke, partly what I said earlier about people losing faith with this stuff is like when they see things done which are deemed to be performative and for box ticking purposes and not because they're genuinely the right thing to do. And I'm sure mental health first aiders have done good in some places, right? But it's where it's a Band-Aid on a terrible culture.
Yeah.
I 100% agree with that. It almost feels like when you have mental health first. So I have a number of issues with this, and listeners will be bored of me saying this, but I'll just repeat them for the purposes of this episode. So the first one is you can't train someone in 2 days of a training course to be able to respond to particular mental health challenges and issues, right? They're not clinicians. They're never going to get that level of training in that amount of time. So all you're literally creating is somebody who can signpost, but often they overstep. They then go looking for problems and then they overstep by trying to get into it because they've got this lanyard and suddenly they've got a bit of power or a bit of, and bless Betty, who's been on the mental health first aider course, she means well. I'm just not sure she's helping in an environment where someone's not already talking or, we haven't got that. And to your earlier point, if there's a workplace culture problem, Betty, bless her, with a lanyard isn't going to fix it anyway. And there's probably a better way to spend your money around mental health first aiders.
I always make this point, my daughter's been studying for 9 years and working in the NHS, and she's still not qualified as a consultant psychologist. So, Betty on 2 days.
Yeah.
And it's all well-meaning. This is the bit. And then people think, oh, I hate these people. I don't. They're obviously well-meaning. They've done it for the right reasons. But actually, I think they end up bringing more risk to an organization than they do benefit. And then the cost, that it's not a valuable use of that money. You could invest it in much more ways. We've talked about some of them early on. When you're going to say something then, I was going to cut us all off, but go on.
I was going to be slightly controversial in that, I love we're talking about layering, but we also need to be mindful of some of the challenges in this country. And we're recording this in the UK today, so I appreciate this doesn't apply for all of our listeners, but we've got an NHS service where the average waiting time for talking therapies can be up to a year, by which point...
It's longer in Wales.
Sure. So, the majority of people accessing those therapies need it now.
Yeah.
So the other alternative is private healthcare in the country, and there is a certain academic requirement, if you like, to access those services, and the people who are attending daycares or are attending inpatient are having to work really hard at highly intelligent things. I know one individual who was a working class individual who really struggled with the actual process of therapy because it was so intellectualized. So again, there's different layers.
Yeah, nice. This episode of You Must Be Woken is brought to you by Metamer Global, the creators of the award-winning Return on Inclusion platform. In the current climate, it's so important to be able to demonstrate the impact of our efforts to create more inclusive workplaces. For the first time ever, organizations like yours can assess the work you've done and benchmark your efforts with assurance and accreditation, even comparing your results with your competitors. Not only that, but the ROI tool will calculate the estimated financial return for every £1 you've invested in your D&I efforts. To find out more about how you can assess your return on inclusion, visit the website www.metamer.global. Welcome back. Before the break, I said we will always ensure we give people the so what. So we've had a nice conversation. We've challenged some stereotypes. We've challenged some norms. We've learned a little bit more about, this topic. What should employers be doing in this space? What if an employer said to you tomorrow, we want to do something, where should we start? What would that look like? And I'll just open it up.
Well, I think my invitation to them would be to, and I do this whether I'm brought in to talk about something like this or not, would be to challenge ourselves to ask what really is the problem here. Because as much as I would love to advocate always for the case that there would be something specific for men, like actually to our many points earlier in this conversation, if the problem is toxic leadership or some other trait that makes the workplace as a whole a negative place, then you probably want to start there. So my invitation would be before you start to step down into the micro, start at the top and say, okay, well, like what's really going on here, and where are the challenges that our organization faces, and then the people within our organization, and then you can start to move down into, okay, and therefore what are some like tactical initiatives that we can put in place for our men? Is that actually, let's just start with some talking circles twice a week. Let's start with a run club. Let's start with a book club, whatever it may be. But I think it would be disingenuous of me to drive straight in at that level, because unless you start at the top, I don't think you'll help men or women.
Do you mean with the leadership
Yes.
team? Yeah. No, it's a fair challenge. How about you, Don? Where would you start?
Yeah, I mean, I'd go right back to basics, and surprisingly, in terms of, I'd ask, listen, hear at all levels. I take your point about leadership, of course, but I'm also very conscious of the average working person out in the field. And if we had to do that anonymously to discover the reality piece, well, so be it. But I think we've got to really hear what people are saying if they're prepared to say anything. So if we talk about validity and assume that about 50% of people will say something, we can start and think about some interventions. I take your point earlier, it's got to be a deck of cards, it's got to be layered interventions, and that might be 100 different things. But that can be packaged really simply for an organisation. And, there is huge focus on well-being and mental health. And by diverting a small amount of budget to that, the impact on getting people back to work, the impact on reducing absenteeism, and also productivity from the workforce is significantly more than the investment.
Yeah, and just to, I guess, back up what you're saying, I consider what you just said there to be an integral part of understanding what's really going on here, which is to hear from employees, because it's not just hearing from the leaders themselves about what they think is going on, it's understanding 100%. The impact of that on employees.
We always say for any kind of intervention, you should do your discovery first, find out what's happening, hear from your people, et cetera, et cetera. I guess one of the questions I'd ask genuinely from the leadership team before I even started is, what is it you want to do in this space, right? Because I see so many leaders who go, oh, it's Men's Mental Health Day. We better put something out and celebrate it and do something and show that we're supporting men's mental health. And I go, great. What are you doing for the other 364 days of the year, right? Because if it's just a one-off thing, your people are just going to think another load of nonsense, and you unplug it, right? Then I would say, to your earlier point about, male leaders in particular, what does your behavior look like? Right? So how do you behave in the organization? And then I'd be asking questions like, what does the behavior of those who get promoted look like? Because you might offer somebody flexi working time, you might offer them parental leave. But if the last 5 promotions have come from someone who's doing 15, 16-hour days, never takes paternity leave, never takes flexi time, like no one else is going to do it either, right? So you may as well have not bothered with all that lovely intervention stuff if what you're rewarding is rewarding people who don't take advantage of these things and don't role model those things in the first place. So I guess I'd be inclined to start with leaders by asking some tough questions of them. What is it you want to do? Because otherwise, if you're not going to do something properly, don't bother wasting your money.
Yeah, and that's kind of why I gave the answer that I did, which is because, and it might feel like it's evasive because to not give some very specific tactical things. Like, I mean, we haven't even touched on like equal parental leave.
Yeah.
There's a really great chap called Elliot Ray's doing some really great work on parenting out loud, which is basically trying to engender this in the workplace, right? Which is to get fathers in the workplace to parent out loud. Right. So you start to do it from within an organization where you've got male role models who are fathers doing that, without waiting for leadership to role model some behaviors. But so there are great cultural movements like that happening. But like I say, depending on which one of the deck of cards you want to pull out, we can probably find 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different examples of those things. But you need to know which card to pull.
Yeah.
And
love that.
For fear of being boring, I come back to the fact that we've got to look at the whole workforce.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's much more contained if we've got a nice shiny office. It's not so easy if we've got people up a renewable site in the middle of nowhere. So
yeah. That's so true, isn't it? Even the basics, that things like access to technology, right? Yeah. And they go, oh, we've got this amazing EAP service. Okay, how do you get onto it? We have to go on the internet. Okay, yeah. But 50% of your workforce don't have access to the internet because they work on site.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I didn't really think about that, right?
Yeah,
So it's just those kind of basics, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah, love that. Okay. What else then? What else would we be saying? So we've talked to employers, we've challenged them a little bit around, doing this properly, doing some discovery. What are some of the good interventions you've seen, or that you would say, that's good, that not so good? So I've clearly had a bias around mental health first aiders, and I wouldn't advise that. So that I would start there. But where would you guys start?
I mean, I touched on it just there, but I think one of the biggest and most impactful things, and it's a bias toward parents, is starting to move towards more equal parenting. Because I think not only is that a policy choice, which is relatively known and replicable, it's also a massive cultural signal around how men are choosing to show up. Because, this is where home and work really blends, right? And you can get people role modeling this at most levels of an organization to say, actually, I'm going to choose to, park this moment in my career. If you're doing that in a way that allows your partner to get back to work, you're signaling what that means for them. And I think it is just a way that an organization can sort of put their money where their mouth is.
Nice.
And then encourage people to do it across all levels of the org. But, that is one thing that is quite topical right now. There's a lot of campaigning going on about it, and I think impacts people at home as well as at work. And then alongside that, there's some of the things we've already touched on, like men's groups, men's circles, that kind of thing.
One of the most powerful things I saw, and it's really simple and relatively low cost, was one of the employers I work with had produced a mental health surgery. And they had true mental health professionals on site for a couple of days a month, and a booking system held away from the thoroughfare so nobody could see, but it was communicated to all teams, small regional hubs that people could literally drop in and talk, and that was significant. You were having people who would never have accessed EAP or any of that come along and were signposted in the correct way.
Nice. I guess the other thing I'd add to some of those things as well is to think a bit more broadly about this topic. And that's not to steer it away from men in particular, because that's what we're focusing on today. But I think there's something to be said around creating intersections between communities in our organization, right? So, we often talk about, particularly where women have been fighting for safe spaces and trying to get men to recognize how, sometimes their behavior without realizing it makes them uncomfortable or whatever that looks like, right? So they call for allies in the male community to try and help role model some of those things and that kind of good stuff. And there's no reason we shouldn't do the same, right? We shouldn't be inviting women to kind of understand things from a male perspective, what they can do to support with mental health, with other things, those kind of things. The more we can bring those communities together to learn from each other about what works and how that can be structured, I think is quite powerful. There needs to be some kind of ground rules are the wrong thing, but the safe space thing, right? That's psych safety around how do we do this. But I think there's a real opportunity because both of you have made this point today already. Just because we do it here, it benefits everybody, right? Yeah. There's a benefit for all our employees if men are happier, healthier, operating well. Just the same as it benefits all employees when women feel comfortable, safe to be themselves rather than something they think the world needs them to be.
And all of this, to your point about really thinking about different industries and challenging ourselves on that too. Like if there are industries that are massively dominated by women, like childcare. And only 3% of early years educators are men. Yet we know we know that children form gender stereotypes by the age of 7. And one of my guests on my podcast was an early years educator. He was a man, and he would receive all sorts of stereotypes about what he should or shouldn't be doing in his role as a man.
Sure.
Now, an interesting table flip because women have to put up with that a lot more than men do. But like, the intervention there is going to be very different to the intervention with your kind of clients or my kind of clients. But I think we would all want to see a great representation of men in early years education, for example.
And I think that there's some societal change got to happen there too. I think it's even more basic than in the workplace. I had a situation yesterday. The person I was traveling with had a very, very bad back, and a mature lady behind them kept kicking the chair. And I turned around and said to her very politely, I don't mean to be difficult, but every time you kick the chair, you're causing pain. And would you not do that? And she said, why? Can't he speak for himself? And I just immediately thought, that's our problem.
Yeah.
But
nice. Yeah. There's another one that I want to just bring into the mix as well, because I've gone back and forth on this about decoupling access to things like EAP. So if an organization has services like, talking therapies available through the employee assistance program and stuff like that, there's something for me about decoupling that away from line managers and away from HR and just making it self-referral, self-access, where you haven't got to do anything. You don't need a referral to access 100%. That stuff. Because in a lot of organizations, if you want EAP, you have to get your line manager to recommend it or refer you based on something, or you need HR to approve it, those kind of things. That feels like an unnecessary barrier to me, for 100%. Me.
To be fair, a lot of the private healthcare companies that are running EAP, if it is mental health categorised, they are self-referral.
Nice.
And I know certainly a number of our clients, again, from backs of toilet doors and things, those are moving very much towards for the mental health. If you've need a operation for something else, that's a bit different. But 100% agree with that. Yeah. It shouldn't need to go through any more layers than.
And if it's a cost issue, right? Get rid of your first aiders. Stop doing that.
But
sorry.
If we come back to the basic, for fear again of being boring, return on investment calculations. If we can reduce absenteeism and get people back to work and feeling good and feeling highly productive, it's a no-brainer. The equations far outweigh the cost.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
How do we try and connect whatever employers do with a sense of purpose? What's the connection for them as an organization? Because, nice to have is nice to have, and nice to do is nice to do. But I find when you can connect things to a purpose, so many more people are willing to engage with it. And these initiatives like World Mental Health Day or Men's Mental Health Day or whatever that looks like, they give a sense of purpose for a day, and that's great. But how do we create more of a sense of purpose in organizations to some of this stuff? So I know working with construction companies like I've done in the past, there is a sense of purpose there because there's a very male-dominated environment, and actually suicide rates are huge. And so keeping their people safe is usually a number one priority for a construction company. So there's almost quite a strong sense of purpose there around safety and well-being, right? Great. But how do we replicate some of that purpose in other types of sectors, other organizations?
Do you mean the organization's purpose and the purpose of even doing this stuff, or someone's own purpose?
Both, I think. I think we want to create a sense of, why do we want to do this other than, because there's stats out there telling us that this is a problem. It's not really a problem from our organization. You get that. So how do you create that sense of purpose?
Just to throw one stat in, because that topic of purpose from the individual is one of the biggest causes of mental health and worse.
Yeah.
So without going too much into the individual, where I've seen some of this work done when I've led sort of D&I initiatives in the past, where I've seen it being mobilized most effectively is when it's rooted in authenticity. And so one of the ways to do that is to, for example, spin up a group of concerned employees who might be able to share some of their own stories, or stories of affected family members, or stories of affected close friends, or whatever it may be. Because I think when worked in organizations where we've done that well, a bit like, removing some friction where you have to get something improved by your line manager, the degrees of separation that you can remove between, the end outcome or the end impacted individual, the closer you can make that, the more relatable you can rate that. People get it sooner, whether that is someone who's been impacted by poverty, whether that's been someone who's been impacted by racism, whether someone been impacted by poor mental health. Like, if someone either in the organization or close to the organization has been brave enough to share something like that, making something feel authentic and like you're doing it for that purpose rather than this month, this day, can make it more likely to land with employees.
Yeah.
And I think that purpose and point is a really important topic, isn't it? Because, you've got to be able to feel that from a company perspective. Otherwise, the purpose and point to me isn't there. And if I haven't got purpose and point, we know that is leading us.
Yeah. So a simple example of what this would be, unsurprisingly, I've done Movember a couple of times, and when I've mobilized men in organizations I've worked with to do that as well, when it really lands is when people share a friend or family member who's been impacted, either because they've taken their own life or because they were been helped by the services that someone like a Movember provides. And so that's kind of what I mean, where you can link sort of personal purpose to organizational purpose to the purpose of a movement in a way that feels real and feels authentic.
And I think that's where I'm going with that question, I guess, because when you think about the Norwich video ad, right, the Norwich video that they did for mental health, that they anchored that on a personal story. So they shocked you at the beginning because you weren't expecting it, and then the emotion came from the story of the two men, right? And and people then anchored into that because there was a sense of that could be my friend. That could, like we all know someone.
Simple and relatable.
It was really simple and relatable. So if we can help organizations who want to do something in this space and are willing to put themselves out there to do that, helping them to understand what we mean by that sense of purpose and how they can make that connection for their people. So I use construction as an example. Their sense of purpose is safety is our number one priority on a construction site. We've got to make sure that look after your buddies, look after each other, protect each other, have each other's backs. That's a real core sense of purpose for everyone working in those environments because it's a number one priority for the organization. But if you're working in a bank, like you don't have that same sense of purpose, but you could have a different sense of purpose, which connects to the human intervention, your friends, your colleagues who have, so to your point, share something that someone's been through or the impact it's had on a female colleague at work. And
and you can cultivate that, with a bit of intentional effort. So I've got a friend who works in a bank, and this isn't specifically related to men, but they had a mixed gender leadership team, and they spent some time working out actually what was this common thread, what was this shared purpose that they had, and they realized that although they were all working for a bank in quite senior jobs where they worked a lot of hours, they all felt like they were doing it in some way for their family. So that they could, provide in the way that they felt they were able to. And that became like a unifying thread for them. That became a purpose in somewhere like a bank, right? Which on the face of it might not have some of the,
And then we come back to the box, don't we?
Yeah, exactly. And this is where it's like, then for me, it becomes very individual, and it comes back to, this is now sort of climbing the ladder from people learning it at first principles to a bit further up, but like then men being able to identify like their own values, their own purpose, what trade-offs are they willing to make? Because I think it can be okay if you've intentionally said, you know what, I am going to slog it for 5 years in this environment because I know that is the best way I can set my family up.
Yeah.
Or I'm okay with this trade-off. We've had these conversations at home. That can be okay. I think it's when you have a combination of men not knowing how to or being able to do that work in an environment where it's also like not discussed, not okay, perhaps a bit toxic, perhaps a bit dysfunctional.
And where you've got unskilled labour that can't necessarily progress.
Yeah.
The whole work landscape has changed, hasn't it? You can earn more stacking shelves in a supermarket than you can taking an old school apprenticeship that would give you a trade. And that's where we see significant numbers, isn't it? And we've got to make sure we capture that too.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. We could literally talk about this for days and days, because I didn't realize the time was flying by. Hopefully, we've given people a real good sense of why this topic is important and what they can do about it in their own workplaces. But before we finish up, Tim, I think you've been prepped for this, but we have a recurring feature on our In the Spotlight episodes where we talk about our first boss.
Yes.
Do you want to tell us about who's your first boss? Tell us who
my
that is first.
My first quote unquote proper job was with a contractor to London Underground, and actually it did bridge the gap between, I guess, classic office roles and more manual labour roles, because my boss, he probably did, the generous interpretation he did an okay job of bridging those divides. The less generous interpretation is that we got the worst of both worlds, because we had a small team of office folk like myself who did the classic corporate functions, and then we had a large team of Eastern European labourers who went and basically put up all the advertising signs on London Underground at night. And so my first boss was a chap who basically worked with us in the office, sometimes went out at night and sort of bridged those gaps. And like I say, sometimes we got the best of both worlds in terms of someone who could bridge that gap, and sometimes we definitely got the worst of both worlds. But it was quite a grounding introduction to the workplace because of that.
Nice, I'm sure.
Things to copy and things not to.
Yeah, I mean, like literally the physical manifestation of that was when we walked into the office, you walked through the warehouse with the vans and all the tools and all the advertising units to get to our little office space at the back. And then, occasionally, I would go out and do night shifts with the guys too. And so it was very different to my friends who had taken like consulting grad schemes or banking grad schemes, whatever it may be, to see both those worlds. And this boss who, I think he did his best, but I think he definitely felt the tension sometimes of like bridging those two worlds, which sometimes a lot of, and actually one of the best things, this is what I mean about like, what is the right intervention for your organization? We did a England versus rest of world 5-a-side match between the office team and the night crew. And we did like 2 or 3 of them, which was, a really great way of going, actually, we need to get to know each other a bit better. What's the best way to do this? Let's just go and play a few football games, right? And that was a great way to like build rapport and build morale.
Nice. So if your boss was getting into the workplace today for the first time as a leader, what's your number one bit of advice for him around mental health or anything to do with workplaces today?
It might be a bit of a cop-out, but the advice that I often give is to put your own oxygen mask on first.
Nice.
Because I think it's very hard to genuinely show up for others, including a big group of others, like a team, unless you're in, a good place yourself. Like I know that I'm a much better leader and much better at working with other leaders because I've been able to do some self-work. And if you can spend a bit of time investing in that first to perhaps realize why maybe you do, lash out, or maybe why you do shut yourself off, or maybe why you do reject certain behaviors in the workplace, like normally always about you, right? Rather than the other person. And so I think if you're expecting someone to show up as a good role model, particularly, if you're asking someone who's a male role model to be brave and vulnerable in a workplace in a way perhaps they haven't done in their life before, they're going to need to prepare themselves for that.
Nice.
So I would encourage him to do some work on himself first before going and doing it on others.
Love that. Really, really powerful. Okay, I'm a very conscious time. So that's it for another episode of In the Spotlight. Tim, thank you so much for stepping into the spotlight.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Tim.
Tell our listeners quickly how they can get in contact with your work and understand a little bit more about what you do.
Yeah, so just you can find me on LinkedIn. My name is Tim Barber. The website for the men's work is The Feel Good Folk, and it's at The Feel Good Folk on Instagram too. And then my sort of day job, people advisory for startups, is The Startup Folk. So any of those places, but I'm on LinkedIn more than I care to admit. So that's probably the best place to start.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thanks for listening to our listeners as well. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. Until next time, it's bye from Tim, bye from me.
And bye from me.
Thanks for watching and listening to You Must Be Woking, the podcast that cuts through the noise for all things diversity and inclusion. We pride ourselves on having honest and sometimes tough conversations. So if you liked our discussions and content today, please do hit the follow, like, and subscribe buttons. It really helps us to reach more listeners. And if you're feeling even more generous, why not leave us a review? It really is the best way for us to grow and help our content reach even more people. You can also find us on all social media platforms at You Must Be Woking, or search the hashtag YMBWoking, where we continue the conversation, including answering more of your questions. See you soon.